November 8th, 1979. Richmond Heights, a quiet suburb just west of St. Louis city limits. A mid-1970s Cadillac Coupe de Ville sat parked on Claytonia Terrace in the pre-dawn darkness. Inside, a man in a tailored suit checked his rearview mirror out of habit, a habit that had kept him alive through 2 decades of mob warfare. He turned the key in the ignition. An explosive device attached beneath the car detonated. The blast was catastrophic, tearing the vehicle apart and scattering debris across the roadway. The man behind the wheel, later identified as John Paul Sonny Spica, a high-level associate and protege of St. Louis boss Tony Giordano, died instantly. By the time emergency responders arrived, there was nothing left to save. Just twisted metal, scorched asphalt, and the unmistakable message that St. Louis had entered an era of violence unlike anything it had seen before. An era that would see the city become infamous for car bombings that shocked even veteran law enforcement. This wasn't supposed to happen in St. Louis. The city had always been a mafia town, yes, but a quiet one. Disciplined, sophisticated. A place where disputes were settled over handshakes in dimly lit social clubs, not with explosives on suburban streets. But by 1979, something had gone catastrophically wrong. The old rules no longer applied. The old men who enforced those rules were dying or losing control. And into that vacuum had rushed a chaos so profound, so self-destructive, that it would destroy in 5 years what had taken 70 years to build. To understand how St. Louis became one of America's most violently unstable, organized crime territories, you have to go back to a time before the Italians ever controlled anything at all. Back to when the city's underworld belonged to Irish political gangs who viewed democracy itself as just another racket to be rigged. Early 1900s, polling stations across St. Louis. Election day meant violence. Men in overcoats arrived at voting locations carrying clubs and revolvers. They surrounded ballot boxes. They intimidated voters. They stuffed ballots. This was the era of Egan's Rats, a gang that blurred the line between political organization and criminal enterprise. For 2 decades, they would be the most violent criminal organization in Missouri. A gang so fearsome that when Prohibition arrived, even Al Capone recruited from their ranks. Thomas Snake Kinney ran the political machine. Willie Egan ran the muscle. The arrangement was simple. Kinney delivered votes. Egan delivered violence. Together, they controlled St. Louis like a medieval fiefdom, extracting tribute from every gambling den, brothel, and illegal distillery in the city. But Egan's Rats were never disciplined soldiers. They were opportunistic predators who took whatever they could grab. On May 21st, 1924, they pulled off one of the largest robberies in American history, a $2 million mail train heist near the Staunton rail yard. 7 rats, all armed with Thompson submachine guns, ambushed the train at 3 a.m., blew open the mail car with nitroglycerin, and disappeared into the darkness with canvas sacks full of cash and bonds. The take was staggering. The execution was flawless. The aftermath was a disaster. Within weeks, the rats were spending money so conspicuously that federal investigators had no trouble tracking them. One bought a new Packard. Another purchased a bar outright, paying cash. A third started wearing custom-tailored suits and dining at restaurants he couldn't have afforded a month earlier. The post office inspector assigned to the case later testified that it was the easiest investigation of my career. They might as well have taken out newspaper advertisements announcing their guilt. By the end of 1924, 11 members of Egan's Rats were in federal prison. The gang fragmented. Some members fled to Chicago. Others tried to reorganize under new leadership. One, a stocky, dead-eyed killer named Fred Killer Burke, would go on to become Al Capone's most trusted enforcer and is widely suspected by historians to have been among the lead gunmen in the St. Valentine's Day massacre, though he was never convicted of that crime. Burke's journey from St. Louis street thug to Chicago executioner illustrated something crucial about the city's underworld. It was a training ground for violence, but it lacked the organizational sophistication to build anything lasting. While the rats were collapsing under their own greed, another gang was operating out of a Jennings Road gas station, running bootlegging operations with slightly more discipline. They were known as the Cuckoo Gang, led primarily by James Hogan and his brothers. The Hogans weren't innovators. They simply copied whatever the rats did, only with less flair and more paranoia. They hijacked rival shipments. They muscled in on independent speakeasies. They killed anyone who refused to pay protection money. But they were never more than a second-tier operation, dangerous but directionless, lacking the leadership to expand beyond a few city blocks. By the mid-1920s, the Irish gangs were either dead, imprisoned, or irrelevant. The vacuum they left behind should have been filled by another Irish successor. Instead, something entirely different happened. The Italians arrived, not as a unified family, but as warring Sicilian factions who hated each other more than they hated the law. Before St. Louis could become a mafia city, it would first have to survive a civil war so brutal, so personal, that its survivors would build their future empire on the corpses of their own cousins. An attic apartment on West Pine Boulevard near Kings Highway. Vito Giannola sat at a small wooden table, counting money from the previous night's liquor sales. He was in his late 40s, a Sicilian immigrant who had arrived in St. Louis years earlier with nothing, and had built a modest bootlegging operation through sheer ruthlessness. He controlled maybe 6 blocks of the Hill, the Italian immigrant neighborhood on the southwest side. He had men working for him. He had trucks. He had no idea that armed men were climbing the stairs outside his apartment. The Giannola faction, known in the neighborhood as I Verdi, the Green Ones, was locked in a vicious territorial war with rival Sicilian factions led by the Russo and Perino families. The violence of the 1920s St. Louis underworld was a product of these competing immigrant crews, each fighting for control of bootlegging territory in a city that seemed too small to contain them all. Angelo Pastori, a Sicilian enforcer aligned with the anti-Giannola forces, had decided that Vito Giannola needed to die. Not because Giannola had wronged him personally, but because Giannola controlled territory that rivals wanted. In the Sicilian underworld of 1920s St. Louis, that was reason enough. December 28, 1927. The attack was overwhelming and methodical. Armed men burst through the door and opened fire. Giannola had no chance to escape. The attackers systematically riddled the apartment with bullets, working their way across every wall, every surface, every possible hiding place. When the police arrived, they found Vito Giannola dead. They found 247 bullet holes in the apartment. They found no witnesses. The crime scene became infamous in St. Louis underworld history, a brutal demonstration of what happened when Sicilian factions went to war. The investigation went nowhere. No one was ever charged. This was the code. You settled your own problems. You never cooperated with authorities. You survived or you died, but you did it on your own terms. The anti-Giannola forces had won, but their victory was short-lived. By 1928, most of them were dead, killed in retaliatory hits, ambushes, and shootouts that turned the Hill into a war zone. The winners of that culling were a crew led by a man named Carmelo Fresina, who would later become the subject of colorful underworld lore. According to neighborhood stories, Fresina had been shot in the buttocks during the factional fighting. As the tale goes, the wound never fully healed, leaving him in chronic pain whenever he sat down. So he commissioned a custom silk pillow, stuffed with goose down, which he brought to every meeting, every restaurant, every social club. Whether or not every detail of this story is verifiable, what's certain is that Frasina understood something his predecessors had not. Violence without organization was just chaos. To build real power, you needed structure, discipline, and most importantly, restraint. You needed to stop killing your own people and start building an actual criminal enterprise. By 1928, the Sicilian factions had exhausted themselves. Too many bodies, too many arrests, too much attention from federal authorities who were now flooding the city with prohibition agents. The survivors called a truce. Not a formal peace, but an understanding. We can kill each other, or we can make money. We can't do both. That pragmatic ceasefire created the space for something genuinely new in St. Louis. A consolidated Italian family, a hierarchy, a commission of leaders who would divide territory, settle disputes, and present a unified front against outsiders. The age of the rats and the cuckoos and the factional wars was over. The age of the Mafia had begun. A social club on Daggett Avenue. The door was unmarked. The windows were covered with heavy curtains. Inside, 8 men sat around a table covered with a white cloth. There was wine. There was bread. There were no weapons visible, though everyone in the room was armed. They were there to formalize the structure that would govern St. Louis organized crime for the next 50 years. Territory was divided. Leadership was established. Rules were agreed upon. No hits without commission approval. No cooperation with police. No independent operations that might draw federal heat. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even particularly sophisticated. But it was enough. St. Louis now had a functioning mafia family. For the next 3 decades, that family operated in relative quiet. They ran numbers. They controlled bookmaking. They muscled into labor unions. They skimmed from legitimate businesses. They bribed police, politicians, and judges. They enforced their rules with calculated violence. Never public spectacles, just quiet disappearances and bodies found in the Mississippi River. They were careful. They were patient. And they were profitable. But they were also unexceptional. In a national landscape dominated by New York's 5 families, Chicago's Outfit, and Kansas City's Civella family, St. Louis was a minor player, a regional franchise, a place where made men were sent when they weren't important enough for bigger cities. That changed in 1960 when a produce distributor named Anthony Tony Giordano took control of the family. Giordano was 53 years old when he became boss. He was short, soft-spoken, and looked more like a grocer than a gangster, which was precisely the point. He had spent 30 years building a legitimate produce empire, controlling the supply of artichokes, olive oil, and imported Italian goods throughout the Midwest. The federal agents who monitored him called him the Artichoke King, a title he wore with pride. But the produce business was only the surface. Beneath it was a criminal network so deeply embedded in St. Louis that it was effectively invisible to outsiders. Giordano understood something fundamental about organized crime in the modern era. The flashy gangsters got arrested, the quiet ones got rich. So he cultivated an image of respectability. He donated to Catholic charities. He attended Mass every Sunday at St. Ambrose Church on the Hill. He held office hours at a small cafe on Marconi Avenue where neighborhood residents could bring him disputes, property lines, business disagreements, family feuds, and he would settle them with the authority of a village elder. People loved him. Police struggled to build cases against him. Federal prosecutors knew he was running the St. Louis Mafia, but couldn't prove it. He had insulated himself behind layers of legitimate business, loyal subordinates, and a code of silence so absolute that even arrested members refused to cooperate. But Giordano's greatest innovation wasn't in St. Louis. It was in Las Vegas, the Frontier Hotel and Casino, Las Vegas Strip. Behind the roulette tables and slot machines in a windowless counting room accessible only by a single reinforced door, casino employees sorted the night's take. Cash was separated from chips. Chips were counted and reconciled against the pit records. Cash was bundled into canvas bank bags. And then, before the money was entered into the official casino ledgers, a small percentage was skimmed off the top and set aside in a separate bag. That bag was never recorded, never logged, never deposited. It was driven to a hotel room on the second floor where a man named Murray Mush Fischetti, a Chicago outfit representative, divided it among representatives from 4 Midwest Mafia families: Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and St. Louis. The skim was elegant in its simplicity. The Frontier was partially owned by mob-connected investors who had installed compliant management. The casino counted its own money. The State Gaming Commission audited the official ledgers, which showed legitimate profits and paid the required taxes. Everyone was happy, except the real profits, the millions in cash that never appeared on any ledger, were being systematically stolen and split among organized crime families across the country. Giordano's share was modest by Chicago's standards, maybe 10% of the total skim. But that translated to $50,000 to $75,000 a month in pure cash, untaxed, untraceable, and delivered to St. Louis in the trunk of a Cadillac. That money transformed the St. Louis family. Giordano used it to expand into new territories, fund union takeovers, and bribe officials at levels previously unthinkable. But he also used it to enforce discipline. The Vegas Skim created a shared interest among multiple families, which meant betraying the operation would bring down not just St. Louis, but Chicago, Kansas City, and Milwaukee as well. No one wanted that heat, so everyone kept quiet. The skim became the glue that held the Midwest mob together. But Giordano was obsessive about protecting it. He micromanaged every detail. He insisted on regular audits. As one of his associates later testified, Giordano even tracked the cost of dairy products at the Frontier, milk, cream, butter, to ensure that casino employees weren't stealing from the skim by inflating food costs. According to underworld lore, Giordano once spent 45 minutes reviewing a spreadsheet showing the price per gallon of chocolate milk over a 6-month period, looking for anomalies that might indicate theft. When he found a discrepancy that couldn't be explained by market prices, he dispatched an enforcer to Las Vegas to discuss the matter with the Frontier's food and beverage manager. The price went back down. The skim remained secure. This wasn't the behavior of a street thug. This was corporate management applied to organized crime. Giordano ran the St. Louis Mafia like a business, with balance sheets, expense reports, and quarterly reviews. His men didn't rob liquor stores or shake down small businesses. They infiltrated unions, controlled construction contracts, and placed bets with bookies they secretly owned. It was sophisticated, it was profitable, and it was sustainable for a while. Giordano's other major investment was less successful. In 1958, a hulking ex-convict named Charles Sonny Liston walked into a gym on the north side of St. Louis. He was 26 years old, 6'1", 220 pounds of muscle and rage with fists the size of hams, and a criminal record that included armed robbery and assaulting a police officer. He could barely read. He had no formal boxing training. But when he hit the heavy bag, it sounded like a car crash. Within months, local promoters were buzzing about him. Within a year, he was winning professional fights. Within 3 years, he was being mentioned as a potential contender for the heavyweight championship. John Vitale, Giordano's underboss, saw an opportunity. Law enforcement officials and boxing investigators widely suspected that the St. Louis mob had financial interests in Liston's career. Estimates ranged from 10 to 12% of his earnings. Liston needed money for training. He needed handlers who could get him fights. He needed protection from the police, who were eager to violate his parole and send him back to prison. The mob could provide all of that. Whether through formal agreement or informal understanding, Liston's rise to prominence was intertwined with St. Louis organized crime. In 1962, Liston knocked out Floyd Patterson in the first round to win the heavyweight championship. The mob now had financial interests in the most famous athlete in the world. The money rolled in: pay-per-view percentages, endorsement deals, appearance fees. For a brief moment, the St. Louis Mafia basked in reflected glory. Not just tolerated, but connected to a champion on magazine covers. But Liston was a troubled man, violent, paranoid, haunted by his past. In 1964, he lost the title to Cassius Clay, soon to be Muhammad Ali, in a fight that remains controversial to this day. In 1970, he was found dead in his Las Vegas home, needle marks on his arm, cause of death listed as a heroin overdose, though many who knew him insist he never used intravenous drugs. The official story was addiction. The whispered story was assassination. The truth died with him. By the mid-1970s, Giordano was facing serious legal pressure. Federal investigations into the Vegas Skim were intensifying, and his casino-related activities led to conviction and imprisonment in the mid-1970s. He served time and was released in 1977, but the damage to his organization was already done. His health was failing, cancer was eating away at him, and his control over the family was weakening. Even after his release, he was a shadow of the powerful boss who had once commanded respect across the Midwest. John Paul Sonny Spica was born in 1934 on the Hill. His father was a laborer. His mother cleaned houses. He grew up poor, tough, and ambitious. Exactly the kind of kid who gravitated toward the mob. By his 20s, he was running errands for Giordano. By his 30s, he was a trusted enforcer. By his 40s, he was a high-level associate with his own crew, handling labor racketeering and loan sharking across South St. Louis. Giordano treated him like a surrogate son, bringing him into meetings normally reserved for made members, trusting him with sensitive information. Spica was being groomed for a formal induction into the family, the ceremony that would make him a made man. But that induction had not yet occurred. His relationship with Giordano was so close that many in the underworld assumed he had already been made. But technically, he remained an associate. That distinction would matter when the politics turned deadly. Spica had developed ties to the Sparrow brothers, independent operators who controlled certain labor rackets. The Sparrow brothers were rivals of Nick Civella, the boss of the Kansas City Mafia. Civella wanted Spica dead, not because Spica had personally wronged him, but because eliminating Spica would weaken the Sparrow brothers and consolidate Kansas City's control over contested Union territories. Civella pressured Giordano to surrender Spica. For months, Giordano defended his protege. He attended high-level sit-downs with Kansas City representatives. He argued that Spica had done nothing to warrant a death sentence. He invoked the old rules. You don't kill a man over business disputes that can be negotiated. But Civella was relentless, and Giordano was dying. The cancer was spreading. His organization was under federal assault. His influence with other families was eroding. He no longer had the strength or the leverage to protect everyone under his umbrella. What happened next remains the subject of debate among investigators and historians. There is no documented evidence that Giordano ordered Spica's death. Instead, the consensus suggests a more complex and tragic scenario. Giordano withdrew his protection. By stepping aside, by signaling to the underworld that Spica was no longer under his shield, Giordano effectively left him vulnerable. Once that protection was gone, others moved in. The Leisure family, David, Paul, and Anthony, had their own grievances with Spica over labor union control. Ray Flynn, another player in the Syrian-Lebanese underworld, also wanted Spica eliminated. With Giordano no longer defending him, Spica became a target. The method of execution revealed who actually carried it out. November 8, 1979. The car bomb that killed John Paul Spica bore all the hallmarks of the leisure crew's signature tactics. Giordano was old school. He hated car bombs. They were too public, too indiscriminate, too likely to draw federal attention and kill innocent bystanders. Giordano's preferred methods were quiet: a gun in a back room, a staged accident, a disappearance. Car bombs were forbidden by the Commission precisely because they created chaos and headlines. But the Leisures didn't care about old-school rules. They loved explosives. They used them constantly. The bombing of Spica wasn't Giordano's style, it was the Leisure's calling card. The blast on Claytonia Terrace sent a shockwave through the St. Louis underworld that went far beyond the physical destruction. The message was clear. The old rules were breaking down. If a high-level associate, someone as connected and protected as Spica, could be killed with a car bomb on a public street, then no one was safe. The Commission's ban on car bombs had been violated, and if one crew could ignore that ban with impunity, others would follow. The bomb that killed Spica was a starting pistol for an era of violence that would make the Sicilian wars of the 1920s look restrained by comparison. But the real chaos didn't come from the Italians. It came from a parallel criminal network that had been operating in St. Louis for decades, mostly invisible to outsiders, mostly tolerated by Giordano's family. They were Syrian and Lebanese immigrants organized into family-based crews, controlling labor unions and construction rackets. They weren't part of the Italian Mafia. They weren't subordinate to it. They were a separate power structure operating under an uneasy truce. And when that truce collapsed, St. Louis descended into a war that would shock the nation. The Syrian-Lebanese underworld in St. Louis traced its roots to the same immigrant waves that brought the Italians. Families like the Michaels, the Leisures, and the Pauluses arrived in the early 1900s, settled in South St. Louis, and built their power through construction, trucking, and union control. They were disciplined, they were ruthless, and they were tolerated by the Italian family because for decades their interests didn't overlap. The Italians controlled gambling and loan sharking. The Syrians controlled labor. Everyone made money. Everyone stayed in their lane. But by the late 1970s, the lanes were blurring. David Leisure was 42 years old in 1979. He was short, stocky, with thick black hair and a temper that terrified his own associates. He ran a crew out of LN&P Vending, a company that placed cigarette machines and jukeboxes in bars across South St. Louis. On paper, it was a modest operation. In reality, it was a front for labor racketeering, extortion, and insurance fraud. Leisure's brother Paul ran the muscle side, collecting debts, enforcing territory, intimidating competitors. Together, they controlled a network that generated millions annually. But they wanted more. Specifically, they wanted the contracts controlled by the Michaels family. The Michaels family, led by brothers Jimmy, George, and Paul Michaels, controlled construction projects across the city. Union contracts, concrete supply, demolition. If you wanted to build anything in St. Louis, you paid the Michaels, They were older than the Leisures, more established, more connected. They had been operating since the 1950s without serious competition. That stability made them complacent. They didn't see the Leisures as a threat. That was a fatal mistake. September 17th, 1980. Interstate 55 southbound lane near the Arsenal Street exit. A maroon Oldsmobile Cutlass cruised in the right lane at highway speed. The driver was James A. Horseshoe Jimmy. Michael Sr., 75 years old, a construction racketeer who had controlled labor contracts and demolition operations for decades. He was alone. He had no security. He had no reason to expect trouble. As his car traveled down the highway, an explosive device attached to the vehicle detonated. Investigators later described the blast as catastrophic. The Cutlass was destroyed, flipping and catching fire. Jimmy Michaels died at the scene. There were no witnesses who could identify who had planted the device or when. The investigation stalled. But everyone in the St. Louis underworld knew who was behind it, David Leisure, and everyone knew what it meant. Open war. The Michaels family retaliated within weeks. November 1980, a parking lot behind LN&P vending. Two Michaels associates armed with shotguns ambushed a Leisure crew member as he walked to his car. Multiple rounds were fired from close range. The target survived with serious injuries, weeks in intensive care, emergency surgery, permanent damage. But he survived. And his survival was, in its own way, more devastating than death would have been, because it meant the Michaels had tried to kill a Leisure associate and failed. In mob warfare, a failed hit is worse than no hit at all. It signals weakness, it invites escalation, and it guarantees retaliation. August 11, 1981. Paul Leisure walked out of his house on Nottingham Avenue early in the morning, heading to his car parked in the driveway. His wife watched from inside. His children were in the house. Paul climbed into his Chevrolet Impala, inserted the key into the ignition, and turned it. An explosive device detonated. The blast shattered windows across the neighborhood. Paul's wife ran outside. She found her husband still alive, conscious even, but catastrophically injured. The explosion had severed portions of both his legs. Shrapnel had torn through his body. He was in shock, not yet comprehending the extent of his injuries. An ambulance arrived within minutes. Paramedics stabilized him for transport. He survived. Barely. He spent months in the hospital. He would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair, a living reminder of what happened when you went to war with the Leisures. But the Leisures' signature tactic wasn't just bombings. It was surveillance. Meticulous, patient, obsessive surveillance. They studied their targets for weeks, sometimes months, learning routines, identifying vulnerabilities, waiting for the perfect moment. Federal prosecutors would later reveal that Leisure associates used various covers for their surveillance operations, blending into neighborhoods to gather intelligence for the next round of attacks. The violence escalated through 1981 and into 1982. A series of car bombs and spectacular explosions rocked St. Louis and surrounding counties from the late 1970s into the early 1980s. Multiple people, including mob figures and at least one innocent civilian who had unknowingly purchased a vehicle that still had an explosive device attached, were killed. Federal prosecutors later indicted dozens in related conspiracies. The casualty count and the public nature of the bombings forced law enforcement to treat St. Louis organized crime as a priority. The FBI designated the city as a major target, flooding it with agents, installing wiretaps, and recruiting informants. One particularly brazen incident involved an attempt at St. Raymond's Maronite Cathedral in South St. Louis. During a wedding attended by Michael's family associates, a bomb was discovered attached to a vehicle in the church parking lot. The device was designed to detonate after the ceremony ended, but the target did not enter the vehicle as expected. The explosion damaged multiple cars and shattered cathedral windows, but killed no one. The incident shocked the city. Organized crime violence was no longer contained to industrial areas or highways. It was in church parking lots. It was in residential driveways. It was everywhere. The FBI's investigation, supported by state and local law enforcement, built methodically. Wiretaps captured conspirators discussing attacks. Informants provided detailed testimony. Forensic analysis linked materials to specific individuals. February 1983. A federal grand jury indicted 12 members of the leisure crew on RICO charges: racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, and illegal explosives violations. David Leisure was arrested at his home. He said nothing. He maintained his silence. He knew his criminal empire was collapsing around him. The trials that followed in the mid-1980s were devastating to the Leisure organization. The government's case was built on the testimony of key witnesses who had turned against the family. Anthony Leisure, David's brother, became a crucial cooperating witness, providing detailed testimony about the inner workings of the organization. Charles Freddie Love, a trusted associate, also cooperated with prosecutors, detailing the planning and execution of multiple bombings. Their testimony was decisive. It dismantled the Leisure crew piece by piece, connecting conspirators to specific crimes, revealing the organizational structure, and providing the evidence prosecutors needed for convictions. David Leisure was convicted on multiple counts, including the 1980 car bombing murder of James Michaels Sr. He was sentenced to death, a rare sentence for organized crime cases, but one that reflected the unprecedented nature of the car bombing campaign. He spent years on death row, exhausting his appeals. On September 1st, 1999, David Leisure was executed by lethal injection at the Potosi Correctional Center in Missouri. He holds a grim distinction in American criminal history. He was the first person in the United States to be executed specifically for a car bombing related to organized crime. Paul Leisure, the man who had been maimed in the August 1981 bombing and spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair, took a different path than his brother Anthony. Despite his catastrophic injuries, despite losing portions of both legs, despite spending years confined to a wheelchair, Paul remained a hardliner. He refused to cooperate with prosecutors. He refused to testify against his family. He maintained the code of silence even as the evidence mounted and the convictions piled up. He was convicted on multiple racketeering charges and sentenced to multiple life terms in federal prison. Paul Leisure died behind bars, never having broken his oath, never having given the government what they wanted. His silence was absolute, even unto death. The Michaels family, decimated by deaths, prosecutions, and defections, quietly dissolved. Their leaders were dead, imprisoned, or had fled the city. The Syrian-Lebanese underworld in St. Louis was finished. But so was the Italian Mafia. August 29th, 1980. Anthony Tony Giordano died at his home. He was 73 years old. He had been battling cancer, and the disease, combined with the stress of seeing his organization weakened by federal prosecutions, had finally claimed him. His 1970s convictions and imprisonment related to the Nevada casino skim operations had already damaged the family's infrastructure and revenue streams. His death created a leadership vacuum that his successors were utterly unprepared to fill. The next boss, chosen by what remained of the family's leadership structure, was Matthew Mike Trupiano Jr., Giordano's nephew. Trupiano was 45 years old. He had spent his entire life in the shadow of his uncle, handling low-level rackets, running a social club on the hill, collecting street tax from bookies. He was competent at those tasks. He was completely unequipped to lead a mafia family. Trupiano's idea of organized crime was running a football betting pool out of a private club on Marconi Avenue. He sat at a folding table, taking bets written on index cards, tracking payouts in a spiral notebook, settling disputes by threatening people with baseball bats. This was the man now in charge of what had once been a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise with interests in 3 states. The contrast between Giordano and Trupiano was so stark that it became a running joke among FBI agents monitoring the family. One agent later testified that Trupiano couldn't organize a birthday party, let alone a crime family. But the joke masked a deeper truth. The St. Louis Mafia hadn't just lost a leader. It had lost institutional knowledge, discipline, and legitimacy. Under Trupiano, the family's revenue collapsed. The Vegas Skim was gone, shut down by federal investigations that culminated in major Kansas City skim prosecutions in the early 1980s. Union control was slipping as federal labor racketeering prosecutions decimated mob influence. Loan sharking and bookmaking still generated income, but it was a fraction of what Giordano had commanded. Worse, Trupiano couldn't enforce discipline. Made men ignored his orders, crews operated independently. Younger members, seeing no future in the family, either quit or got arrested trying to freelance. The structure was collapsing not because of external pressure, but because of internal rot. A wiretapped conversation between 2 St. Louis mob soldiers, recorded by the FBI. One says, "Mike's a fucking joke. He couldn't run a lemonade stand." The other replies, "Giordano's rolling in his grave." The first one laughs. Giordano would have put a bullet in him by now. That conversation captured everything wrong with the St. Louis Mafia in the 1980s. The respect was gone. The fear was gone. The discipline was gone. What remained was a collection of aging men running street-level rackets, complaining about their boss, and waiting for the inevitable federal indictment. It came in 1992. Trupiano and his son-in-law were indicted on charges related to illegal gambling operations, primarily bookmaking. The trial was relatively brief. The evidence was straightforward. Both defendants were convicted. Trupiano was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, a relatively light sentence because the charges focused on gambling rather than the more violent RICO predicates seen in the leisure trials. He served his time and was released in the mid-1990s. After his release, Trupiano returned to St. Louis and opened Trupiano's, a restaurant on the Hill. He also took a job at a Ford dealership in South County, trying to rebuild a legitimate life far from the criminal enterprise that had consumed his family. But his health was failing. On October 22, 1997, Matthew Mike Trupiano Jr. suffered a heart attack while at work at the dealership. He died shortly after, at 62 years old. His death marked the functional end of the St. Louis Mafia's leadership. He never attempted to rebuild the family. There was nothing left to rebuild. The federal prosecutions that destroyed the St. Louis Mafia were methodical, comprehensive, and devastatingly effective. RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, allowed prosecutors to target entire criminal enterprises rather than individual crimes. If you were part of a conspiracy, if you benefited from its profits, if you participated in its operations, you could be charged with racketeering even if you never personally committed violence. The law was designed to dismantle mafia families, and in St. Louis, it worked perfectly. Between 1983 and 1992, federal prosecutors mounted extensive investigations and trials targeting the St. Louis Mafia and its associated Syrian-Lebanese crews. Dozens were indicted. The overwhelming majority were convicted. The convictions weren't just for soldiers, They included bosses, underbosses, and every significant earner in the organization. The verdicts carried sentences measured in decades, not years. Defendants who cooperated received reduced sentences but were marked for life as informants, making them unemployable in the underworld. Defendants who refused to cooperate died in prison. There were no good outcomes. The family was systematically dismantled piece by piece until nothing functional remained. But the real death blow wasn't the arrest, it was the loss of revenue. The Vegas Skim ended in the early 1980s after major federal prosecutions exposed the entire Midwest operation. Federal oversight of labor unions made racketeering nearly impossible. Loan sharking became less profitable as banks offered easier credit. Bookmaking moved offshore, run by international syndicates that didn't need street-level muscle. The economic model that had sustained the mob for 50 years evaporated within a decade. By the early 1990s, there was no money to pay soldiers, no money to bribe officials, no money to fund operations. The mob didn't die violently, it died broke. The St. Louis Mafia didn't dissolve with a formal meeting or a ceremonial vote. There was no dramatic gathering of made men deciding to close shop. No final handshake sealing the family's fate. Such stories circulate in the underworld. Romantic notions of aging bosses acknowledging the end over espresso and reminiscence. But they are apocryphal, the kind of legend that grows around the death of institutions. The reality was far less cinematic. The family simply faded through what investigators called attrition by graveyard. The few remaining members either died of old age or remained inactive, living quiet lives in retirement, drawing Social Security, trying to forget. By the late 1990s, the FBI officially declared the St. Louis family dormant. There was no dramatic ending, no final confrontation, just the slow erosion of a criminal organization that had lost its purpose, its leadership, and its relevance. Today, St. Louis has no functioning mafia presence. The social clubs on the hill are restaurants. The warehouses that once served as fronts for illegal operations are legitimate businesses. The men who once commanded respect and fear are dead, imprisoned, or retired, living on Social Security, watching their grandchildren grow up in a world where organized crime is something you see in movies, not on your street. The Syrian-Lebanese crews are gone. The Irish gangs are gone. The Sicilian factions are gone. What replaced them wasn't another criminal empire. It was nothing. A void. Because by the time the St. Louis Mafia collapsed, the entire economic and social infrastructure that sustained American organized crime had been destroyed by federal law, cultural change, and the simple fact that the younger generation saw no reason to follow in their father's footsteps. The story of the St. Louis Mafia is not a story of defeat. It's a story of obsolescence. Other cities, New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, still have functioning families because they adapted, because they maintained discipline, because they had leaders smart enough to evolve with the times. St. Louis had none of that. It had one great boss, Tony Giordano, who built an empire on produce distribution, Vegas skimming, and sheer force of will. When he died in 1980, weakened by cancer and by the federal prosecutions that had sent him to prison in the 1970s, that empire died with him. He had failed to institutionalize his knowledge, failed to mentor effective successors, failed to prepare for a future that arrived faster than anyone expected. The Syrian-Lebanese crews self-destructed even more spectacularly. Their bombing campaign from 1979 into the early 1980s drew so much federal attention that they guaranteed their own destruction. Their war wasn't strategic. It wasn't even personal in any coherent way. It was ego, paranoia, and violence for its own sake. They didn't lose a conflict. They simply annihilated each other until no one was left standing, and federal prosecutors swept up the survivors. And the city? St. Louis moved on. The Hill became a tourist destination, famous for its Italian restaurants and bakeries, its immigrant history sanitized into nostalgia. The highways where bombs once detonated are now just highways, indistinguishable from any other stretch of interstate. The social clubs are gone or repurposed. The men who once controlled the city are forgotten, their names known only to historians, FBI agents, and the few elderly residents who remember when the mob wasn't a historical curiosity, but a daily reality. The St. Louis Mafia lasted from approximately 1928 to the late 1990s when it was officially declared dormant, roughly 70 years. For most of that time, it was a minor player, a regional operation, occasionally profitable but never nationally significant. It had one moment of genuine power under Tony Giordano from 1960 until his death in 1980, when it controlled Vegas Skim money and operated with discipline. That moment ended when Giordano died and the organization collapsed into violence, incompetence, and federal prosecution. The Syrian-Lebanese cruise lasted even less time, maybe 30 years of real power, from the 1950s to the early 1980s, ending in a campaign of bombings that accomplished nothing except their own destruction. Compare that to the New York families which have survived, albeit in diminished form, for nearly a century. Compare it to the Chicago outfit, which adapted, evolved, and maintained some presence even today. St. Louis couldn't do that. It lacked the leadership, the discipline, and the institutional memory to survive the transition from old-school bosses to modern criminal enterprises. When the old men died, no one competent replaced them. When the money dried up, no one found new revenue. When the feds came, no one had the sophistication to evade them. The final irony is that St. Louis gained national infamy for its bombing campaign over just a few years, in the late 1970s and early 1980s. A handful of years of chaos and spectacular violence. A brief, intense period that destroyed what had taken 60 years to build. That's the ratio. 60 years of careful construction, a few years of violent self-destruction. It's not dramatic, it's not cinematic, it's just sad. A cautionary tale about what happens when criminals mistake violence for power, when they confuse intimidation with strategy, when they fail to understand that organized crime requires organization, not just crime. There's a final detail worth noting. In 2008, a documentary crew interviewed former FBI agents who had worked the St. Louis mob cases in the 1980s. One agent told a story about surveillance photographs from the early 1990s. They showed elderly men, former made men, sitting on a bench outside a cafe on the Hill. They were drinking espresso. They were talking. The FBI agent watching them said he felt sorry for them. "They looked like my grandfathers," he said. "Just old men talking about old times, knowing the world had moved on without them." That image, forgotten men on a bench reminiscing about an empire that no longer existed, is the real ending of the St. Louis Mafia. Not a shootout, not a trial, just obsolescence, just time passing. Just the slow, unremarkable fade into irrelevance that awaits all criminal enterprises that fail to adapt.